Hello. I am going to be making a video right now on what I would say is American conservatism. Um, American conservatism is essentially based on the founding principles of the American Union in 1787. Um, Many conservatives don't really know the history of this country and tend to sort of ascribe some sort of, in my opinion, bullshit narratives to this country that we are a Judeo-Christian country. Um, you can certainly argue that a number of the states were founded as on Judeo-Christian values, like I know Massachusetts was very Judeo-Christian, um, especially in Salem, where the infamous witch trials were held. They were very Judeo-Christian, um, and then you had other states that were founded on different Judeo-Christian religious variations. Um, but yeah, the individual colonies were founded upon Judeo-Christian values. Essentially, God, golden glory, for golden country, and for, all these old-timey, kind of brutal values. But then, after we gained our independence from, Great Britain, and we developed our own system of government, it was designed by the greatest minds of this country at the time. It was designed specifically to be a secular, godless country. Individual citizens could be Christian or whatever religion they chose, and if they happened to be elected to public office, they were not forced to give up said religious affiliation. They were able to continue to freely practice and express it, but the government itself was supposed to be neutral in enacting laws about religion. Religious members of Congress could not restrict or fully integrate their own religion into the country as an official religion enforced by law. Meaning this country is a secular, godless country. Now, because this is a majority Christian nation, people, especially right-wingers, who are, I would argue, not really American conservatives, they are religious Christian conservatives, who want to conserve their religion, have sought to enshrine their religious values into the country, even though while that is a religious conservative thing to do, that is an American liberal decision to do in light of American conservatism. Because depending on the different types of conservatism, like there's what you might call the generalized conservatism, which is general conservative values, and then there's, American conservative values, which is the belief in the fundamental rights and freedoms and the preservation of the American Union, and essentially the best, policies, whatever they may be, that further the goal of the Constitution and further the rights and freedoms of Americans and to restrict that of government tyranny. That is American conservatism, which given, much the more general conservatism principles, is to a great degree antithetical to the American conservative values, which is that, hey, authority, respect authority, do as you're told. America has never really been, I mean, to some degree it has, but the American spirit that is enshrined in the Constitution is that, hey, yeah, you don't have to completely respect authority. It is your constitutional right to disrespect authority. You have every right to do so. And to stand up to authority, to challenge that authority, to make corrections to what you consider to be abusive authority in law. Also when authority infringes upon your rights, that authority does not have to be respected. Again, it's all about don't trust authority, don't trust your leaders, question them, and hold them accountable. Not very traditionally conservative, not the traditional conservative position, which is, oh, tally-ho, be respectable and don't question the king, which is the more traditional question. And then we, the American revolutionaries, were like, fuck the king. We're not going to follow him anymore. So, yeah, that's essentially, I would call, American conservatism, which is conserving the original American values as enshrined in the Constitution. So that's, and now I know one commentator on YouTube, JJ McCullough, one did sort of a deal on conservatism, and that conservatism is sort of a bit more of a right-wing philosophy. To some extent, he is correct. I mean, because the traditional conservatism, the general traditional conservatism that's been adopted, is definitely more right-wing, though depending on the specific conservatism you're talking about, meaning the specific political philosophy you're wishing to conserve, you're definitely taking, I guess, a more right-wing, this is we want to conserve this philosophy, we want to conserve these traditions, which is very much right-wing. But you can have left-wing traditions that you wish to conserve, say, the American revolutionary spirit, the idea of overthrowing tyrants, being free and prosperous individuals. Those are left-wing ideas because they are challenging hierarchical structures, they are challenging authority, and oftentimes they tend to challenge traditional religious values, because who is the ultimate authoritarian figure? God or Jesus. And yet the revolutionary idea that we should respect, that all authority should be questioned, even that of God, and that we should hold nothing sacred, we must always be scrutinizing and further improving to create a more perfect system. That doesn't really jive well with traditional conservatism. So traditional conservatism does not jive very well with American conservatism, and that is the ideal that we should be, that in 1787 the greatest minds of our union at the time said, okay, this is not perfect, but it's the best we as a collective could agree to at this point. and we have enshrined the ability to add amendments so that we can continue to create a more perfect union. Those are the values of the American Constitution. Those are hence the values of constitutional conservatism and the values of American conservatism, I would argue. Now, of course, you can't, I don't think the same position is to be 100% constitutional conservatism all the way, constitutional conservative all the way. I mean, I don't think it's even possible because, the definition of American constitutional conservative, given the Constitution, is pretty broad and vague on a number of issues. Now, of course, on very specific issues, it's very clear. But, like, say, people should have fundamental rights, and now a number of conservatives, traditional American conservatives, or traditional conservatives in America, do not really hold to constitutional conservative principles. Even some quote-unquote textualists like Neil Gorsuch are more religious conservatives than constitutional conservatives, because constitutional conservatives would say that, hey, we need to follow the Constitution, and the Constitution says that, hey, the government is founded on secular, religious principles. That means that while the government is meeting for government purposes, there should not be sermons. Now, members can invoke God when they're giving a speech, or they can pray in their seat should they so choose, but to have a specifically designated time for praying or for a speech or an invocation is definitely anti-constitution, anti-conservative, or at least anti-American conservative, pro-religious conservative. So yeah, that is definitely some food for thought, because that goes against American ideals. Again, again, American principles are also for personal freedom, not for unlimited government. Not now strong enough government so that we can protect the liberties of the people, but not too much government so that government does not infringe upon those rights. And in a number of cases, so-called conservatives of traditional religious values infringe upon the ideals of the Constitution. Now, of course, those ideals might not, the specifics of which might not be enshrined in the Constitution, making them legal, but they definitely go against the spirit of the Constitution, like, say, being anti-homosexual gay rights, or even anti-abortion, because you're restricting people's rights and being pro-discrimination, etc., etc. Those things, while may appeal to traditional religious conservative and cultural general conservative values, they are antithetical to American conservative values, because it's big government crushing your individual freedoms. And so that is the American conservative position. Whether it's economically right-wing or left-wing is debatable as to the official American conservative position. It can go you can see it go both ways, but generally it is providing the general welfare and being the best union possible, and also given that its ideals of liberty and freedom, to some extent that would say not that would limit, say, market forces and capitalism, because it would entail a decent amount of regulation. And that would be because market forces unchecked can be authoritarian, can end up becoming authoritarian power structures that challenge the liberties and the freedoms of the people. If they coalesce a large enough if they coalesce enough economic power, and considering that the American government was conceived in such a way so that we would not have a very centralized power structure, but a much more decentralized power structure, so that we wouldn't have so much power concentrated into like a king, or even like a king and a cabinet of ministers. We would have much more decentralized control. Even Parliament, our version of the UK's Parliament, Congress, which is not a parliamentary system, wouldn't even have so much power, that because the rest of the power would be divided evenly amongst the states, and also divided amongst the president, Congress, and the courts. So complete capitalistic, free market, right wing, free enterprise sort of ideals, and low regulation, minimal regulation, doesn't necessarily seem to jive well with those values. Now, if you go with well over reasonable regulation, that definitely goes against it, because it's not very free. But you shouldn't go for like barely any. You should go for regulations that restrict and go for very strict antitrust laws that very much that does restrict the freedom of that can quite considerably restrict the freedom of corporations and other such entities from getting so large that they can threaten the fundamental freedoms of the country. So it's a balancing act between not having overbearing regulations, but also making sure that corporations aren't getting so large that they can, essentially form monopolies and trusts, oligopolies, whatever, and essentially turn our system from a democratic republic into a oligarchy, which unfortunately to some extent has happened, and so it is up to so-called leftists or socialists, that the right wing of America would like you to call it, to actually uphold American conservative values of, say, freedom and freedom and the democratic right of the people to institute a good government, to uphold their rights. So yeah, it's a sad day for conservatives when they're not really the American Conservative Party. Now, to some extent, Democrats or left-wing people aren't really American very conservative also, specifically in the issue of the Second Amendment, because the Second Amendment is a left-wing idea that the fact that your average citizen has a right to keep and bear arms is fairly left-wing and radical, versus the idea that, oh, only weaponry should be in the hands of, say, the elite or the military is much more of a right-wing idea that was most common. It was like the norm of, you know, of kingdoms and societies like that, because the peasants, if they have weaponry, they, like normal arms, they could revolt against the king and the queen, which is precisely, to some extent, the reasoning in which we have such a Second Amendment, because if things go to shit, it's the right of the people to overthrow that government and institute a new form of government, as Thomas Jefferson so eloquently put in the Declaration of Independence. Now, of course, it's not officially in law, but because I don't think it, logistically it can't be, otherwise people would be making bogus claims. So that's a thing where it's technically going to be illegal, but should it be the right call? But when it is the right call to make, people will know. And evil government will either be overthrown or we will die trying. And so that is the American conservative position. It is a very left-wing and radical idea that, common folk should be armed and ready to defend their own liberties, because traditionally it was the king lording over them, and the king and all the king's men were the ones that carried the arms, because they were the specifically trained, and they didn't want to potentially cite rebellions if they were particularly unfair to the peasantry, and allow the peasants to have such ready access to armaments. So again, now of course, the Second Amendment, at least as interpreted, is not very left-wing radical, because that doesn't mean that the government you are entitled to a free firearm from the government. No, you have to purchase yours through your own personal money that you have acquired. So it's not that left-wing of an amendment, at least until the Supreme Court, I guess, finds a way to interpret it as, yeah, the government does owe you a free firearm, which is not an unreasonable conclusion, I would say. It is possible that the government isn't, that you are entitled to at least one free firearm from the government. But yeah, because the left-wing position is as much redistribution as possible, whereas the right-wing position is consolidation as much as possible. And that's what many people conflate communism in this regard with far left, because it seeks to redistribute things, but it's actually more of a radical centrist position, because it wishes to redistribute the means of production through the collective ownership of the state, which is essentially meaning we're redistributing wealth in sort of more symbolic nature, that technically everyone owns the means of production, but only a handful of individuals that actually run the state are the ones that actually run it to work efficiently, and those And that's how you get sort of a very hierarchical but yet technically equal sort of middle ground, which ends up resulting in state capitalism. But just a odd version of it. But yeah, so those are some of the general values of American conservatism. So anything that promotes the liberty for the citizens of America is American conservatism. Anything that restricts their freedom arbitrarily based off of religious mores and essentially, the more generic conservative values is anti-American conservatism. You are not a true constitutional conservative. If you do so, you are being pretty liberal with the Constitution. You're being pretty liberal with American values to stretch them. So yeah, that's my video on American conservatism. Bye.